I have a little confession. I've been doing videography for about 4 years now, and it's only been recently I've actually truly learned how to shoot in log successfully. Is that bad of me? The thing is with log footage is when you're filming it, you can't see the contrast and you can't see the saturation. So you're filming a grey, shitty, horrible mess, and you don't really know what the footage is going to be like until you get it into Premiere Pro or Final Cut and turn it into Rec 709, or in simple terms, make it look contrasty and saturated like it should be. There's a lot of things on the internet that say that you should overexpose log footage by +2 stops, but depending on what kind of metering system that you have for your camera, then that will differ. If you're shooting on a center weighted metering system, then this frame will probably be maybe overexposed with looking at it on the screen, but it's actually +1 at this moment in time. It's not +2 stops. And the reason for that is because I use a multimetering mode and everything around me at this moment in time is really dark. So the talk about exposing at +2 stops is quite frankly bullshit. Okay, so maybe it's not quite actually bullshit. Maybe you should use it as a rule of thumb and actually use your histogram. Obviously, you want the histogram to be roughly in the middle, so then when you stretch it out, you can stretch it out equally for both the shadows and the blacks and the highlights and the whites. So if you was to have your histogram all the way to the blacks, then you are underexposing your image. If you move it all the way to the whites, then you are overexposing your image, meaning that you could clip some of your image. Yeah, but Danny, you're not telling us anything that we don't already know. Correct, I'm not, but I'm going to show you the easiest way I find to make sure that your shot is exposed properly when using any kind of log footage, specifically on the Sony A7S III. So by far the best way to actually expose your shot is to use a grade card or a color checker. I don't own one of them because one, they're very expensive, and two, I don't actually have the opportunity to really use one. When I'm out and about filming, I'm not wanting to hold a grade card up and get the exposure right just to film a short segment. But I would highly recommend using one if you are doing a talking head piece or if you're actually wanting to do some proper filming and spend some quality time on pre-production and making sure that the shot is perfect in camera. So one of the first things I do to make sure I'm exposing correctly using S-Log 3 is to set my zebras correctly. I use the 2 custom zebras inside the A7S III and I set one to 91 plus. So that means that anything above 91 or more IRE, then it starts to show zebras, and the maximum it can be is 94 in S-Log 3. I set it ever so slightly lower than the threshold just so I can see what's really close to being blown out, but not quite there yet. So the first step in making sure your scene is correctly exposed is by making sure that none of it, or as little as possible, is hitting that zebra threshold. So at this moment in time, it's saying that it's +2 on the multimeter, but obviously that's taking into account the big white walls behind me. But as you can see, there's no zebras on the screen. Now the scene is still correctly exposed. Now if I turn this way ever so slightly, you can see the zebras coming in through the window, but I'm still perfectly exposed. And the reason for that is because outside is still really, really bright. So you can only really use this as a rule of thumb. But obviously this isn't just talking about the bright parts, because if you're filming in a really, really dark environment with a lot of black, then obviously black is meant to be really low towards the bottom. So if you don't really have anything what's white to the 93 and 94 IRE, then you're not going to get any clipping. You're just going to increase the ISO until you get to the point where you do get clipping, at which point the blacks will look really, really weird. But I'd say maybe 80% of the time I use this method to expose all of my shots. And even if it is overexposed but not quite clipping, I can bring the exposure down before it gets to that conversion LUT to make it correct. So when it goes through the conversion LUT, it is correctly exposed. Also, one thing to note is by overexposing your shot ever so slightly, you actually reduce the amount of noise in your shot, because you're obviously bringing your shadows up using the actual picture profile, but then when you bring the shadows back down and the blacks back down, you're minimizing the amount of noise. Something we always want. The other way I use zebras is when I'm wanting to expose for the skin tones. So if you're wanting to use the zebras to expose to the skin tones, I change my zebras, my second custom zebra, to around 73 ±3. Then all you have to do is change the exposure of your camera so you start to get the zebras going across your face, as you can see right now. Once again, at this moment in time, the multimeter is still saying +2, so this is technically overexposed, supposedly, according to what everyone's saying. But now if I click back to the other zebra meter to make sure that nothing else is actually clipping, then you can see that everything is actually under the threshold what it should be. Now, once again, this is still just a guide for you, and sometimes you do get the exposure slightly wrong, but when you're using a camera such as the A7S III and filming in a log, as long as you've got the exposure roughly right, you can always pull it back once you get into Premiere Pro or whatever editing software that you're using. Now, if you're wanting to get technical and make sure that you're exposing the shot correctly using a grey card, you just have to set that zebra to around 40 to 42 IRE. Hold the grey card up in front of your camera and make sure that the zebras are going across the whole of the grey card. And at that point, your shot should be correctly exposed, but you could still clip the whites and the highlights depending on how contrasty your scene is. Log footage is quite hard to work with if you don't know how to do it. And it might be quite daunting once you get into Premiere Pro because people think you have to actually physically change the contrast yourself. But that's where conversion LUTs come in. There's many conversion LUTs available. The ones I use are from Leaping LUTs and I massively recommend using them. What I do is add the conversion LUT to an adjustment layer on top of all of my footage, and if my footage is overexposed or underexposed, I go to the footage itself and change the exposure there. For a long time I'll hold my hands up and say I actually made a mistake with that. I actually used to adjust the exposure after adding the conversion LUT. But by doing that, you aren't actually changing the exposure of the clip, you're changing the exposure of the actual grade and the color correction. If you made an error in terms of white balance or exposure in camera, you need to correct that before it hits any conversion LUT. Because that conversion LUT will stretch the footage out in terms of color and contrast a lot differently depending on how it is exposed going into that conversion LUT. And that's where you get all the errors in terms of skin tones and the blocky horribleness which you sometimes get. Hopefully this video has helped you out. I've got a video coming out in the next few weeks all about color grading and conversion LUTs. So if you want to see that, hit the subscribe button to be notified when I next release that video. If you enjoyed the video, then hit the like button as it allows me to show this content to more people out there on the platform. And fingers crossed, I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.